Hello and welcome. I'm Jim Tolles. I'm a spiritual teacher, and today we're going to talk about awakening to action. I know that's one of the big questions that's always coming my way is how do I do this or what do I do? It's always about doing in Western society. And I spend a lot of time talking about the inner work that we do, but eventually there are things that we'll do in the external world that we'll be called to do, and I want to discuss what conscious action is. And that's essentially what I mean by awakening to action, is that sense that there are things that we want to do and we're going to go and do them. But it's very different than how our egos think about that. So that's going to be the topic we'll discuss today. But for this initial couple moments, just taking a few deep breaths to settle in. And if somebody can type in the chat pod on the right to let me know that you can hear me, it'd be great to have that quick little sound check. For those of you who are new, you can put your questions and comments in the right-hand chat pod. You have to be logged into YouTube to do so. And in general, I just ask that you keep most of the comments and questions pointed to me, and so not a lot of crosstalk with each other, because otherwise, people's questions could get lost. It's a small space. And as everybody's logging on, just taking a few deep breaths, being here, being now, because we're always here now. Thanks, Rob. I appreciate the comment. I always start with everybody breathing and relaxing because it's just so important to allow ourselves to calm down for our minds to open. If our minds are not open, then we tend to stay in our usual ego habits. And our usual ego habits basically pick and choose what we hear. So we'll hear things that we want to hear and not hear things that we don't want to hear. Well, that doesn't really help us, does it? Or that just keeps us locked in the cage. So part of breaking out of that prison cell, of course, starts with relaxing, and that it's just so important to allow ourselves to open and to be able to feel the truth. Because whenever any of you say that something resonates, many of you are familiar with this term, resonance isn't coming from somebody else. It's not coming from me. It's something arising inside of you. And it's important to be able to hear that. So take a couple deep breaths, take a couple more, and then take a couple more after that. And just allow yourself the space to relax. There's really nowhere to go in these talks. And just pointing back to the truth that you are here now and helping you kind of land in your body. Thanks, MMR, for letting me know. It's good to see you too, Connor. I hope you're well. Awakening to action. A lot of the initial actions that I talk about when I'm working with someone is really around creating space to go inside, to start to do inner work. And I can't overemphasize the importance of making that space for yourself, that in and of itself is a worthy action. However, that's not usually what our egos want to do, and so that kind of immediately illuminates a problem, that we consider some actions to be worthy actions and other actions to not be worthy actions. Why is it that going within, meditating, and creating these practices for ourselves is often considered not worthwhile? If we want to be able to move consciously and take action in the external world and other things, why is there this division? Why are we saying that this is not a worthy thing? And it's something I really encourage everyone who's listening to think about. Think about how we divide something into a worthy action and another into an unworthy action. Because a lot of these ego judgments are going on in the background, and they're part of the problem. Doing our inner work is really all about being able to understand ourselves. This is why so much of the time when somebody asks, like, well, what do I do next? What do I do for a job? Or how do I find a romantic partnership? Or all these different things, I say go within first. Because we don't really understand why we want what we want. We're just acting out based off of what society has taught us, what our upbringing taught us, and what we now are replaying into our own minds. That we're reminding ourselves over and over, this is what I want, this is what I want, this is what I want. But we don't really know that. And so this inner view, this drawing up the mirror to reflect back to ourselves these different wants and to look at them, is really a critical step to doing any sort of conscious action in any other part of our life, because otherwise we're mainly just running on autopilot. And with a lot of society, that'll reinforce a lot of things like I have to have a job, right? That sort of a belief. We never even stop to look at that, to question it. And there are other things that keep getting reflected back to us. And so people get lost listening to what everyone's telling them, and then they replay it in their own heads. And so there becomes this other part of the choir going on in their head saying, this is what's important, this is what I should do, this is on and on and on. One of those things is the belief that you need to do things. And truthfully, we're always doing things, right? We're breathing, we're eating, we're moving, we're sleeping. So it's not like we're ever not in action. What's important is to slow down the amount of actions we're taking so we start to understand what's happening inside of us. And I will get to what this conscious action part is, but it's just so important to keep setting this foundation. That if we're going to talk about acting consciously, we have to know ourselves. Otherwise, we're coming from a place of disempowerment. We don't know ourselves. We don't know why we're doing the things we do. We usually think we do. We can't distinguish between intuition and ego desire unless we do our inner work for the most part. And even those of you who are very intuitive, that can actually cause more trouble because it's kind of like you're 50-50. So it's like 50% ego, 50% intuition, and it gets kind of twisted up into some very interesting and strange ways. And so you can kind of both be right and wrong about situations that you feel. So peeling apart the ego and the desires is just really, really important to be clear about what is intuition, what is not. We do this by stopping and slowing down. We get out the journal. We have spiritual teachers or healers, spiritual friends, spiritual communities. We read spiritual texts. We do all these things. And you hear I just use the word do. So we do a lot of things to cultivate this inner space. And so that to me is one of our initial and most important and primary conscious actions, is creating the space, is creating the time, is investing the money. All these different things that we do so we can start to understand ourselves, to understand how this thing called whatever your name is interacting with life and how you're interacting with yourself. We have a lot of interactions with ourselves, especially in our minds. Often a lot of that's rather abusive, where we're being critical. Like if you're meditating and a part of you is saying, oh, I shouldn't be, this is a waste of time, or this isn't good, or I'm not doing it right? That's very abusive. Not particularly conscious or kind. But as you go, you start to drop these illusions. You start to understand what is intuition inside, what is the deeper flow inside, what is nourishing myself, what is supporting myself, and that starts to push you towards actions. Now, what's interesting is every now and then, right about the time some of my students are getting comfortable with this inner work part and meditating and stuff, it's like, okay, now it's time to do those things that you want to do. Those things that have stayed with you, because that's the thing about intuition I've noticed. You don't have to remember it. And it kind of stays with you. These things that are really important for you to take action around or to be involved with. People can go through a lot of inner work, and then you still really want to be a mom or a dad. Right? And then it's easier to trust that because you know yourself, you've done the inner work, and you're not just following along what society and what biology tell you to do. And basically what most of society and biology tell you to do is you're supposed to get married to a member of the opposite sex and have kids. And that's just a constant cultural program. For many of you, that's not a truthful program, but in this example, we'll say that it is. And so then go. Trust yourself in that impulse. Present yourself in that way, towards prospective partners, that's what matters to you, And that can create an interesting level of vulnerability. And sometimes people are like, well, I don't know if I'm ready yet now, right? And so right about the time for some people where it's time to act, suddenly it's like, nah, I don't want to do that. Can we just meditate some more? It's like, no, this is part of that progression, that in knowing yourself, there's certain things that become clear. Follow that clarity, trust that clarity. That is part of taking action. If you don't, now you're in a new level of denial and yet a whole other way. The interesting part about that is sometimes what we're learning is how to be vulnerable, how to be open. And we don't want to act from that place. We think we're going to be hurt. But you're not going to learn how to act from places of openness and vulnerability until you do that. And there's a thing about the ego that it doesn't really know what's going to happen to you, but it just sits there behind the scenes and keeps scaring you. I want to add that we're not waiting to be completely free of issues, completely free of unconsciousness. Don't think about moving to the time of action to be like completely purged of all of that. I don't know that that ever happens for anybody. I'm sure there's a situation out there where it feels true that somebody's gotten to that level of clarity. But there are certain initial parts of our inner work that are so important to have any level of clarity to stepping to action. And in stepping to action, some of our next levels of inner work are revealed. Right about that time, I guess I'll just go back to the individual who wants to have children. Where suddenly it's like, well, they're afraid that the prospective partners won't like them. They're on a dating site, or they're telling somebody, on a date, this is what really matters to them, or something like that. And so now you're getting these deeper fears of rejection, lack of self-love, the need for validation. It's all kind of the same issue. I'm just giving it different words for you. Suddenly that gets revealed when somebody's being truthful. And this is important for a variety of reasons. For one thing, you're in charge of your own self-love. Seeking a romantic partnership isn't about finding love from another. And so as you've done your work, you start to see those things, and they come up rather surprisingly in those different situations. And sure, some people will not want to proceed further in connecting with you, but that to me is a truthful way of proceeding. Where a lot of, I guess I'm going to talk about dating today, where a lot of dating is not truthful. It's about putting on masks so the other person likes them, and then they attempt to get what they want from each other, rather than being truthful and saying, this is where I am. This is what's important to me. Right? So there's a real level of honesty to any conscious action that we're going to take. But as I said, it starts with that self-honesty in your inner work, and then it continues to build. It's like more and more places where you just have to be honest, genuine to who you are. And it's not the sort of blunt, tell people exactly how you feel sort of thing, because that's more of an ego thing where the ego doesn't know what it is. So it just shoots off stupid opinions that it doesn't understand, but it's what it feels at the time. Once again, this is why we have to start with our inner work, because otherwise we're just creating more suffering for others. We're not being honest, really. We're just being blunt about our level of ignorance, but we don't even realize how ignorant we are. Taking conscious action really is moving into spaces of illumination, into clarity. Knowing ourselves allows us to know other situations. Knowing ourselves starts to help us to understand what situations we really care about. One of the themes that I'm starting to kind of explore more on my blog, as some of you notice, is around conscious action. Next week I'm going to be talking about hunger. It's not an issue that I've talked about pretty much at all, but it's a real one in human terms. Hunger is hunger. You can change your perspective on hunger 1,000 times, but it's still hunger. If you are hungry and you're malnourished, it doesn't matter how your ego looks at the situation. It's a painful one for the body. We can certainly remove any self-blame or those types of things, but hunger is still hunger. That's a real issue. And that's what I see a lot of people as far as bigger issues, beyond things that are kind of immediate concern. Those types of issues tend to draw a lot of people on the spiritual path. That's not new. I mean, you've had Mother Teresa helping the poor, and plenty of other examples of people in spiritual traditions, of all traditions, that want to help the hungry, help the poor. Because those are real. There's nothing made up about it, versus a lot of ego issues are completely made up. So that tends to be one of the things that draws a lot of people on the spiritual path as they get clear in themselves to start to work on some of these fundamental human issues that have existed for most of humanity. It's not the only way people may be drawn, but it's just something I think is important to point towards. When people are hungry, a lot of social problems rise up out of those situations, like crime. There are many people who don't want to be criminals, and that's a heavy term to use. Once we start to use labels like that, all sorts of triggers and things come up in people's minds. But when you're hungry, you're going to do a lot to try and feed yourself. If you address that issue, you address a bunch of other issues that grew up out of that. So root causes, once you understand how to work with root causes in yourself, you start to look more directly at root causes of issues in society. Because if you address those, you address the others. Doesn't mean that other issues won't call to some of you to work on. Whether you're protesting, something going on with like an oil pipeline that's going through an area that it shouldn't be going through, or some other thing that calls to you. Women's rights, gay rights, human rights of all kinds. Right? That may not necessarily get at the root cause, but it may be a critical place and a meaningful place for you to work. So meaningful is an interesting term because we're so used to ego defining meaning rather than meaning kind of arising from us. The more clearer we are in ourselves, the things that arise inside of us really don't require a lot of thought. It's just something that kind of you're drawn to. And you don't necessarily have to try as hard to engage with those situations, with those issues. A lot of our ego ideas will have us striving and struggling because we think struggling is the way to make changes in life. And we don't struggle when we're really taking conscious action because of a couple of things. One, we start to understand our actions are limited. There's only so much we can do. And so understanding limitation brings us to certain levels of peace. Additionally, we also understand that we're incredibly powerful. And we can be at peace with that, and we understand the importance of action when we're coming from this space of love and understanding about ourselves. So it's this interesting paradox that we get used to of being limited in influence, but also extremely powerful. When we're not at peace with these things, we can get in beliefs that we're doing more than we are, or that we need to do more than we are, right? Trying to overreach in terms of control, trying to make people think the way that we think and force society to go certain ways. And the other way, we can disavow and devalue our power, and so we don't do anything because it doesn't count. Like we hear this around election time where people say, well, my vote doesn't count. It's like, well, if you don't vote, then it won't count at all because it can't be counted, you didn't vote. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's how a lot of social problems and other problems go on in life. They become self-fulfilling because of the way we believe. And so if we believe we have no ability to act or to help or to do any of those things, then we don't do it. Or we minimize our efforts, or, it just becomes a sidebar sort of a thing in our life. So while I'm not necessarily advocating that you go do any specific cause, what I'm pointing towards is that there are things that kind of arise inside of us to do. And then we go and we do them and we engage with them and we see what arises next. And there's a way that we very much focus on the process, not necessarily on the goal. I often make a distinction between aspirations and goals just because it helps to give two words for people. So think of goals today as being the ego desire. The ego has to get to the top of the mountain. Think of an aspiration as something that you would like to have happen and you move towards. So you can put a lot of energy towards an aspiration, but if something shifts in life, it's not so important that you get to the top of that mountain. You just continue to follow the shift because you start to trust the deeper intelligence inside you that's guiding you towards the places that most need you and the places where you most need to be. So awakening to action is coming from that space of knowing yourself, coming from the space of being in the present moment and playing the process, allowing the process to evolve, to understand how you want to engage with any situation, whether it's your dating love life, whether it's championing gay rights in a time where there seems to be a lot of hate crimes that are now growing back up in parts of the world, the US being one of them. All right, so there's a lot of different places where it can take you, and you have to trust it. And it may move you towards things that you didn't realize you cared about, or you wouldn't necessarily have thought that would be a place you'd want to go. And this becomes another way where we have to continue to trust this arising inside of us. That maybe we thought we were going to move towards doing something to help in the whole gay rights front, and then you end up in renewable energy, or you end up in just helping serve food at the homeless shelter. Or maybe you end up just being a full-time mom. These aren't, one isn't better than the other. So any sort of rating system that may be going on in your mind, you should also be mindful of saying, well, this is better than that. It's like, I often remind my students who are parents, you are raising the next generation. Your ability to help them be able to be mindful, to be loving, to know themselves, to process issues, because kids, one way or the other, are going to have different issues they have to deal with. It's not necessarily the parent's fault. It's just part of how it is in life. But if you give them the tool set to deal with them, that's deeply empowering. So there's a huge amount of gifts that you can offer through being a parent. That in and of itself is enough, and it's a full-time job if you ask any parent to be raising children. Or maybe you're just called to be a beach bum, and to surf every day. If that is what's genuinely calling for you, if it's not an avoidance, it's not any sort of laziness, and only you can know this, then that's where you need to go. It's really that simple. In some regards, I often see the world as kind of like a big ecosystem with humanity, where like each plant has its role, and we're all our own individual plants. Taking action is just a kind of accepting of ourself as an apple tree, or a pumpkin plant, or a corn stalk, right? Those are just what we are. That's what naturally arises, and we learn this by doing our inner work, by listening to ourselves, by trusting ourselves. And as I said, there's this interesting way. Each time we open and we take action from the space, we step deeper into this reality that life is unknown. We step into our own openness, our own vulnerability, and that will expose more of our own issues. If what we're trying to do is really just get approval from others, that self-love validation issue, that's going to get exposed. Because some of you will take on tasks where you are not going to be approved of, where society, or at least pieces of society, will tell you that you're stupid or you're wrong or whatever. The unconsciousness of the world does not stop because you become conscious. You're just a little bit better at understanding the reefs and rocks in the ocean underneath you. And how you navigate it when you're consciously aware of these things is different. Thanks, Suresh. So take a couple deep breaths with what I've just said. Once again, I like to remind everyone, let's go slow. This isn't just a mental discussion. Let's make it more than that, dropping into the energy, into your hearts, into your bodies. I always like to remind people that it is important to take conscious action from a sense of being a role model. That we aren't really seeing a lot of conscious action. We see a lot of people doing a lot of things for a lot of ego desires and are trying to control and manipulate a lot of things on every side of any issue, actually. Many people can be very well-meaning about wanting to help the environment, but they're coming from their own ego desire. They're coming from places, their own sense of powerlessness that they're projecting onto the environment. They're trying to reclaim their own power through trying to fight for a rainforest. So fighting for the rainforest is a worthy goal, but that's not going to resolve your own powerlessness issues. And even if you win one battle, then there will be 5 more battles that you see because you haven't resolved the core issue. when we resolve core issues like that, you may find that you don't care about the rainforest at all. And that's not in any sort of disregard to the issue. It's in understanding yourself and where you are most called to interact with life. And this is really what I mean by awakening to action. It's just that sense of these are the things that call to me. This is where I'm going to go. And this is where something natural inside responds. Natural is not necessarily habitual. It's important to not think that this will be easy for you. Sometimes there'll be things that you're called to do that will require a tremendous amount of change, like getting an education. So if somebody is really interested in accounting, but you've been an artist this whole time, that's a big shift. And you're going to need a lot of support to make that shift. Or you can go the other way from being accounting to being an artist. And there is a naturalness that you just kind of have to get used to, where it just feels like things kind of do themselves inside you, even if it's difficult. You really shouldn't hold on to any idea that awakening to action, taking conscious action, is going to be easy in any human sense. It can be. The ease that we feel is really inside, that we're not resisting ourselves, that the whole of us moves towards something. And it's something I can only point towards, right? I can't open up my chest and says, this is what it looks like inside, right? It's just something you have to know in yourself. And the more truthful it is, the more you aren't concerned about the goal. Because you're just sharing your love with the world. The apple tree never is thinking about, gosh, I hope people like apples. It's just flowers and makes apples, and some people like apples and others don't. That has nothing to do with the apple tree. Other people's responses to you rarely have anything to do with you. It's unfortunate that most people don't see each other because we're just projecting our ego desires. And that's why I'm always saying start with yourself to understand your desires, your projections that you're putting onto other people. Sometimes people are exactly right where they belong in the sense of doing work that really matters to them, but they've had this different projection that it's not worthy or it's not good enough or it needs to be a certain way or look a certain way. And so they're devaluing something that's already natural. They already are making apples, right? They're not trying to be a peach tree or anything like that. So they just say, oh, this isn't good enough, or I'm bad for it, or whatever. There's like so many ways that we can just devalue ourselves, disenfranchise our own path. And then you go through your work and like, no, actually this is right. I'm making apples. So for anyone who's new, I usually go for about a half hour, and so I'm kind of coming to the end of that initial set of thoughts. You can type in comments and questions in the chat pod. Please be polite to me and to others. We want to keep this a kind space. And you have to be logged in to do that. For anyone who's new and just stumbled across this live stream, my name is Jim Tolles. I blog regularly at spiritualawakeningprocess.com. And for anybody who would like to support me, this is a free talk, but I do accept donations through my blog, through PayPal. So on the right-hand side, there's a PayPal button where you can donate if you feel called to, but you don't have to. I'm happy to do these things for free. And I'm very grateful to all of you who have financially supported me in the past. It means a lot. That's why I'm here. And I think, just in mentioning that, it brings up the concept of co-creation. Co-creation can be a little bit of a new agey term that can kind of turn people off, but it really is a sense that we have a part we can do, and then there's like the rest of life, right? And so the more we drop into the flow in ourselves, we kind of have a sense of how life is moving and where we want to move in that river. And think of the river like having many currents and eddies. Some eddies are just spinning around and round, and some currents will take you into rocks, and others you can move through more easily. Sometimes a current's easier to manage, and other times it takes a lot more effort. But this is part of what we kind of look for inside ourselves, is to feel is like, where am I being drawn? And for the 100th time, I just have to say, you have to do your inner work, because most of the time what we're drawn towards are habits, what society's already taught us to do, and what feels easy. And those aren't necessarily correct, not necessarily always wrong. That's the muddiness of life, and why we have to do our inner work, is like there's overlap. And so we can do the right thing for the wrong reasons, do the wrong thing for the right reasons, and so on and so forth. But it's really important, the clearer we are, that we're coming from a space of humility, and that we're co-creating with life. We're co-creating with society in general. We can't make other people be any particular way. We can act as role models towards being loving and kind towards others, but it doesn't mean other people will learn from it or like us for being that role model. So it just has to be true to you, these actions that you take. You have to really, really trust that truth inside you. This isn't blindly trusting. This isn't some new level of emerging spiritual ego. And that's a problem for a lot of people. That's why I'm always saying you have to go deep enough. You have to really get down to your core issues, and you start to grapple with some of the fundamental issues. And there are 3 fundamental issues, as many of you know, that I talk about: fear of death, fear of pain, and the drive to procreate. And those are essentially what the ego is built on. So the more you can engage with those, the better you can be at being clear about yourself, about what is truthful for you, and not just something that's being echoed out from that most primal part of us. In so doing, it makes you very powerful in how you co-create, and that tends to make some of the things that you'll want to do just tremendously easier. You may be surprised at how easy things can get at times, actually in the physical world, when you're joining with that flow and trusting it and trusting yourself. I see a comment from Suresh. During the emboss, mentioned an integration process or embodying process. It's a very confusing phase, not after a goal, but would like to know, how does one know that this phase of awakening is complete? Well, that's just one of those things you know when you know. So I would say if you don't know, then you're not complete. That there are plenty of these deeper issues, like I just mentioned, the fundamental issues. And on top are core issues like fear of the unknown, the need to feel loved or validated, need to feel wanted, right? Those are kind of core issues that sit on top of these fundamental ones that we work on. And as I also mentioned earlier, so we're probably not going to be completely done with all those issues when we start taking actions, but we're much more aware of when they're triggered inside us and what they're doing and what they're telling us. Because most of those messages are wrong. So sometimes, let's say some of you want to have like a YouTube channel. I know some of you already do, and you're speaking your truth. And there'll be times where like you feel a lot of fear in opening up to that level of authenticity. And so what's the triggered fear? The fear that you're going to suffer some sort of pain at some point. So that's kind of one of the fundamental things there. And so you breathe into it and you notice, it wants me to hold back and or not speak. So in that instance, the conscious action is to speak, to go put up the video on the YouTube channel or something like that. You can have it go the other way too, where there are times when we need to be quiet and to go within, and this is part of knowing yourself. But as I said, the more you understand how these primal things function inside yourself and what they tend to do for you, because it's going to be really simple, especially with the 2 fear-based ones. You're either going to run from it somehow to get it done with, to get it over with, or get away from it. You're going to want to fight it somehow. You may freeze or faint in some regard. So these are the 4 big ones of what that reptilian brain back there is doing. It's not complicated. The ego will make it seem like we're more complicated than we are, but we're not that complicated. And I think the better you see what these things are doing inside yourself, it makes it clearer what actions you're going to need to take. Connor says, really enjoying the talk, Jim. Resonant and empowering. You're welcome. Hi, Gwen. For those of us earlier in our inner work, can you elaborate a little more on understanding the difference between the ego-based decisions and intuitive decisions? Thank you. I would first of all point out to the starting out section of my blog, and there's one of the posts up there is Intuition, a short guide, and it has a bunch of different intuition posts all collected into that blog post. Ego is almost always going to be a fear-based thing. It's going to be about getting something, protecting something, fear of losing things. Those are all ego decisions that are going to get illuminated, where intuition tends to be kind of optional. even strong intuitions. Unfortunately, we usually kind of fuse them together, right? Our ego response and our intuitive decisions get all mixed together. But that's why meditation and journaling is really the start that I often talk about, because in meditation you start to feel, what are you like when you're relaxed? What sorts of thoughts and intuitions come up when you're relaxed? And it's going to be a lot easier to figure that out when you're relaxed versus when things are more high stress, and so you're partly triggered by an event. So that's one of the aspects of intuition. Journaling, of course, is about understanding, how does your ego work? What does it want? What's it scared of? What are its patterns? Because the ego is very pattern-based. It's not that hard to figure out what's ego, because it says the same types of things 100 times. And it's usually, I'm scared, 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 in about a bazillion different ways. I mean, sure, sadness and anger in there too, right? Anger, a little bit more associated with the fight mechanism. But you can figure it out pretty soon. It's really not as difficult as it seems. Just initially, we're not used to looking at ourselves that way, so that's why it can seem challenging. And you have to be honest, Gwen. That's just how that is. You have to be honest with yourself about how you're thinking and what you're believing. And shine a mirror on it. So I hope that's helpful. Thanks for the question. What other questions do people have about awakening to action? One of the funny things too is the more truthful an action is to yourself, the less you think it's any kind of a big deal. The ego is kind of funny because it wants things to be a big deal. It's like, oh, look at me. Not everybody's this way, but a lot of people are, right? You know, even if they don't want to admit it, it's like, oh, look, yeah, I'm doing this great thing. And then when you start doing something that's just truthful to you, like the apple tree creating apples, it's just not a big deal. It's like, everybody's like, your apples are amazing. I'm like, well, thanks. It's not that big of a deal. Hi, Bridget. Nice to meet you. When I am relaxed, the anxiety comes up. I breathe, go into the anxiety, and it seems like it mysteriously dissipates. I don't always get images or words, just feel as deep as I can. Yeah, that's great. That's the thing about a lot of our fears. They just kind of come and go when we really focus on them and we go into them, then they run away. And sometimes that's enough. Not every fear is going to have a big story to it. Let me know if there's a question in there that you have, Bridget. And thanks to everyone thus far for your questions and comments. And I welcome any others that people have. It's really powerful to come from the space of knowing yourself. And I'm going to be talking more about power. My next newsletter, if you're not already signed up, it's a free thing. There's a sign-up form on the blog on the right-hand side. I'm talking about power. I'm writing a blog around what it means to embrace true power. And it really comes from the space of clarity, of knowing yourself. And when you know yourself, you see life more clearly. When you see what's real, you can engage with what's real. Hi, Esther. I see the immense importance of social political action in these times, but I also feel no interest in doing anything. How do you tell if this is my ego being afraid or an authentic disinterest? You sit with it, Esther. You can sit and meditate. And you just kind of trust yourself, like whatever you need. Like if your own healing is what needs to happen first, and that's what needs to happen first before forging off into these other things. I mean, especially with political action, it's such a charged thing. And people are not coming with spaces of clarity into those issues. They're coming with a truckload of ego issues and fears and their own problems. And as I said, it's on every side of an issue. And so doing our own inner work, if we're not clear about something that we'd want to engage with, is just kind of the space that's going to be the most important to go through first. And as I also said earlier, it's like you don't necessarily have to be involved in a social political cause. I really feel like the more we're all involved in the things that are most truthful to us, that there's a deeper alignment, deeper flow that starts to arise in society as a whole. And I can only encourage you to trust that when you're in harmony with yourself, that in and of itself is connecting to all of us anyway. That's a powerful force, to be in your own love and your own harmony. So go towards those things, Esther, if you're not clear about anything that you really want to do. And don't worry about if you're afraid or disinterested or avoiding anything. I hope that's helpful. Laura says, thank you, Jim, for always acknowledging the effort of those of us trying to be conscious parents. Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the parents who really get it, as far as, being a conscious parent and trying to raise their children so they're prepared to deal with the garbage of life in conscious and kind ways. They know that doing their own inner work is huge, that the spiritual path is not something you wait for. That can be a problem for some of my other parent students who are like, well, I don't have time. It's like, well, then what are you teaching your children? Because if you don't have time for spirituality, for knowing yourself, for coming from spaces of clarity, and there are a lot of difficult demands that parents get placed on them, I understand that, but this is not a fair life. And I'm not going to be fair in any way about this. It's like, if you don't do these things for yourself, you're not going to teach them that. And it's just so important because, as many of you know, what do we do on the spiritual path? We kind of rewind ourselves back to our upbringing, to all those lessons we needed to learn, and we start to teach ourselves that and to let go of pain we didn't know how to let go of because our parents didn't know how to let go of them. So it's super huge. And Laura, I appreciate your comment. And I know that your work and your heart is to be a conscious parent, to work through your issues so that your kids are going to know how to do this growing up. And that's a huge service to the whole wide world. There's a couple less kids that are going to be so reactive and so angry or so scared all the time. They're going to be able to say, oh, this is my fear. I can deal with it. I can breathe into it. Mom showed me how. And it will really be that simple. And kind of like Bridget mentioned a little bit earlier. Sometimes just breathing into this momentary discomfort and it's done. That's it. It doesn't have to be a huge deal. And if we've practiced this since we were kids, and our parents had taught us all these things, then you would just do that naturally. You wouldn't hold on to that pain. It wouldn't build up. You wouldn't self-medicate. You wouldn't blah, 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 right? This huge structure of self-avoidance that we do. So another comment from Bridget. I've noticed those awakening to world events as a reflection of humanity are awakening in their personal lives too, me included. You just answered my question as Esther asked it. Oh, okay, cool. From Connor, you mentioned knowing ourselves and discovering our true selves. I also heard you say in the backup interview that you see the soul and true self as one and the same. Yeah, I do. I try not to get into too much intellectual nitty-gritty. That's why I often say, if there's anything that doesn't feel true to you, you let that go. Trust your intuitive knowing for all of you as you're sitting here with me. Some things you're ready to hear, some things you're not, some things I'm not really right about, and some things I am. And so that's why we have to listen to our intuition to find a way through all this stuff. And that isn't necessarily an exact thing. It's not exact words. I'm using English, and English has certain structures and its logic and language that are prohibitive to certain other ideas. So we try not to, at least I try not to, make too big of a deal around ideas. I try to offer these ideas to point you in a direction, and if they don't point right, then don't use them, and don't worry about whether these ideas match up or consistent. It's not as important to God, in my opinion. From Margin, thank you for the webcast. Could you talk about desires? If one has desires, does that mean they are still in the grip of ego? How to let them go? This is using language some more. Why I make a distinction between kind of a basic need or an urge, something that rises like the urge to eat, and desire. And a desire would be like a desire for a hamburger. All right, so the desire often masks deeper urges inside of us, where the urge to eat that's authentically true. Like we want to eat something, we're hungry. But the desire that masks on is an interpretation of what to do with this urge. So a lot of the work is about kind of peeling those things apart. Many other desires are just taught to you straight out by society, like the desire to have a high-paying job in a white picket fence house. You don't know that that's what you actually want, but if people tell it to us enough, this is kind of going back to the rules of propaganda. If somebody tells you something long enough, you'll start to believe it. And that's kind of an unfortunate truth. So a lot of our desires is just kind of cultural propaganda. It's been told to us so many times that we just immediately believe, yeah, that's what I should want, is the house with the white picket fence, when it has nothing to do with what actually really matters to us. So just question all desires. Write them down in a journal. Just get them out of your head so you can see them. Some of them will be immediately ridiculous the minute you write them. And that's the point of it. Because the ego has a lot of power when it can hide in the back of our heads and just kind of whisper in our ears and you should want this, and you should want that, and you should want on and on and on. So get them out into the light, and that's when you can start to really, really investigate. Is this something that's truthful to me? Is there a hidden urge, right, to be of service? Let's say that's hiding underneath the desire to work at a homeless shelter. So there could be something authentic there, but there may also be this desire to be a good person, to get your own approval. We do a lot of things just for our own approval. That's masking the urge and maybe manipulating it or otherwise corrupting it. And we want to peel that apart so that you can move with the greatest clarity and kindness in any action you take. So thanks for the question, Margin. From Bridget, I guess a question would be, humanity awakening and ordeals is or can be the first stage of awakening. I don't talk about humanity as a whole. I talk about individuals, because it just depends how you want to look at humanity. And a lot of what technology is doing for us right now, Bridget, is creating feedback loops. And we can create these feedback loops to tell us whatever story we want to hear. So if we want to hear about, how to be, super racist, we can go select certain Facebook groups, certain, websites, and just listen to that all the time. And we would believe that life and everybody is getting more racist, or we believe we all should be racist. And people are doing this with a spiritual path, where you can set it up that you're hearing certain stories over and over again. What I always care about, Bridget, is that people go inside and do their inner work. In doing your own inner work, that's the most important influence you can offer to humanity. And whether humanity is becoming more or less conscious, that's not something I know how to measure. I don't want to get into. And I think it can be kind of a avoidance of doing our inner work because we're too busy thinking about these other stories going on someplace else. Bring it back to ourselves, bring it back to the local level of how we interact with our families, with our friends, and our local communities. And that, to me, is the most important part. If we truly want this to be a more conscious place, that's part of the boots on the ground. We're all soldiers in the spiritual fight. That, to me, is where we need to go and how we should think about it rather than opining about the state of humanity as a whole. Thanks for the question. Hi, Esther. She said, thanks. I have a lot of other things to address anyway, like ending my relationship, moving, healing, and going to school to change my career path, so that makes sense. Yeah, that's a lot of stuff. And good luck. And sending you lots of love, Esther. From Connor, I'm curious, when we are children and our egos are developing, do you think we repress our true souls, or does the soul awaken later in life? So as far as repression, probably to some degree, we mimic what we see. So I really think that we need to appreciate that that's just kind of a fundamental part of the animal that is a human, right? We mimic what we see to try and get our needs met. And there's some basic psychological things that you could probably research in terms of like how we choose to do that, whether we try to be the good child, so by being nice and playing by the rules, we get attention, we get our needs met, or the one that's the bad child and acts out to get attention, to get their needs met. And, some of these basic things that we just have to honor as part of how we develop in the beginning. And later on, we really can now deal more mindfully, like with those core responses to surviving, to living. So I wouldn't put it in such a hard term to say that we repress. We're just trying to survive. Right? We're children. We don't have the conscious capability really to think through in the way that we're thinking through now. And as far as, soul awakening later in life, I think we have to kind of be clear about how we're defining awakening. I think what you're asking about is, does the soul become more conscious? Awakening to me is a space that's always here within us. It's always there. It's the floor we're standing on. And what we often call a spiritual awakening is something kind of clears on the floor and we notice we're standing on a floor. Right? It's always been there. And we're like, oh, I'm standing on a floor. And the experience, the response to seeing that is different for everyone. So awakening can be very, very different. And the distinction I make between awakening in terms of how we continue to kind of grow and change spontaneously on our own versus a spiritual opening where we just kind of see the floor, we have the realization, and then we somehow kind of forget. And things don't keep moving inside. So the awakening, the way I talk about it, is really a response that something just gets ignited and starts moving on its own. So whether, we want to call it the soul awakening or humanity awakening to our soul, I don't know. I'm just not sure how important that distinction would be. I think the most important, as I said, it just goes back to doing the inner work. And whether you have an opening and you realize something, then take action on that. It's like, well, if this is something that's truthful to you, follow that understanding. Or if something starts moving on its own, trusting that inner movement and following that flow. So I don't know if that was helpful, Connor, but there it is. This is from the Fields Club. Do you think mental health illness problems can be cured, alleviated by spiritual inner work? Not sure if this is a silly question. Thanks. No, it's not a silly question, but we will really want to honor all aspects of healing. It depends on the issue of what's going on for somebody. If we're talking about something that's a chemical imbalance in somebody versus something that's just kind of built up over time, like let's say it's depression, or it could be depression that's being caused by a repressed trauma. And so then often, the more upset or, the more inner turbulence somebody has inside them, the more you kind of want to have multiple avenues to support somebody, whether it's from what I'll call the overt spiritual path, where we're actually talking about spirituality, versus the deeper truth is everything is spiritual, right? Everything's connected, everything's energy. That's what I mean when I say everything is spirituality. So that would be kind of not covert, but that's the deeper truth, the human aspect of being a spiritual teacher, being a spiritual healer. We talk in certain ways and we do certain things, but that does not preclude other support. So I think that's the biggest thing that I want to emphasize, is that there are multiple supports to address any issue and can be brought into the sort of inner work to address different problems. And you're going to address different things differently. Somebody who's just really having a horrible psychosis and their ego self is too fragmented to work with. I mean, that's going to be really best, I think, in the hands of mental health practitioners. But, there are a lot of us who are very powerful spiritual teachers. So I don't want to give a hard answer to this, because a lot of people are self-diagnosing these days, and they often limit themselves in terms of what types of help they seek. And all of life can be a form of help and support, and it's important to engage those different things as you need them. So I hope that's helpful. And Bridget says, yes, it can be a big distraction watching world events unfold, even with the best sources. Thanks, Jim. You're welcome. And Margin has said, I have no pull to meditate in the conventional sense, meaning sitting, closing eyes. How crucial is meditating to awaken? Well, once again, I want to define, when I'm talking about awakening, right, that's a space that's already here. It's a practice of noticing that's already here is an important one. And that's part of what meditation can do. Start to notice that there's a part of you that's just always silent, always noticing, watching every thought, every emotion, every physical sensation within you. So that to me is actually really important, because we're so caught up busy doing things. And there's all kinds of ways you can meditate, whether you're seated or you can do a walking meditation, things like that. But I would be very cautious about not meditating, just because in Western society there's such a pull to keep doing things. And once again, a lot of our action, and just kind of cycling back into this whole topic of awakening to action, a lot of our actions are coming from self-avoidance. That's why going within is so important. In regards to how long you should meditate, it's different for everyone. That's part of understanding yourself. Start off with 15 minutes, work your way to a half hour. Some people like 45 minutes, some like an hour. I'm a half hour at a time sort of a person. So I can't tell you how long to do it. This is also part of your own journey of understanding yourself, Margin. And that's just so crucial to be able to sit with yourself and let go of any idea about goals, about whether you're going to become awakened and have that spontaneous arising where energy starts moving through you. What we're all on is the conscious path. And the conscious path I distinguish from awakening in the sense that awakening is already here, but we can become more or less conscious. And it happens all the time where people become less conscious. They get more and more scared and upset and more reactive. That's becoming unconscious. You're being controlled by all these hidden responses, desires, and issues. Where we become more conscious, we understand what those issues are. And the more we understand it, we tend to release them. And that tends to open our eyes and so on. So that's how I prefer to talk about this. Think of the process of becoming more conscious as the human aspect of us, versus the awakened space is always right here. It always embraces us exactly as we are, even if we don't. Looks like we have a few more minutes before I'll be done for today, and this will be my last free talk until second week of January. I think it'll be the 11th, and it'll be at 6 p.m. Pacific time. I haven't decided what I'll do. You're welcome to make suggestions or email me through the contact form. If anyone who hasn't asked a question would like to ask one, now's a great time to do so. And as I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to support me and my work, donations are appreciated. You can donate through my blog, spiritualawakeningprocess.com. There's a PayPal button on the right. And of course, please share things, because these days it's getting more and more difficult to be seen. There's just so much stuff out there. So sharing and liking, stuff like this and my blogs is just really, really helpful, because otherwise it's just all about having to pay for advertising nowadays. So from Suresh, he says, when the heart feels like it's breaking or aching on the cellular level, is that what is said about the heart awakening? Also goes same for the gut area where energy seems to be predominant. Once again, I don't like to label these things. What I say is go into the ache. Listen to it. Really breathe into it. Allow that stuff to come up and see what arises. Don't get into any sort of labels. I would say there's nothing to be scared of for the most part. If it gets too persistent, what I would encourage you to do is go see a doctor. And this goes back to the mental health question, where I just encourage you to embrace all tools of life, all supports. And sometimes, if something's very persistent, that's a good thing to do. And then if the doctor says, oh, your gut's fine, then you just come back to breathing and allow any emotions to come up. If something is an energetic issue that's stuck inside that's trying to come out, the tendency is that it will move. It won't stay in the gut. It'll move and go other places. If it's a genuine physical issue, it tends to stay there no matter how long you breathe into it. So those are just some thoughts to consider. From Margin, to reach the state that Eckhart is, the one that you are one with all. And don't worry about that. We're already one with all, Margin. That's part of the reality. It's not a reaching. It's an acknowledgement that we're already in that state. And then in acknowledging that, we start to notice all the ideas and all the beliefs and pain that we've piled on top of ourselves to ignore that truth. And Sarah says, thanks for your selfless service. You're all welcome. Thanks for all the thank yous. Esther is asking, do you have any thoughts on how to deal with repeating situations that mirror unhealthy, painful family dynamics? Is the key in going into the pain so I don't repeat it? Yes. Because that's what you're trying to avoid, is the pain inside yourself predominantly. But I definitely encourage you to keep exploring all the great healers out in the Bay Area as far as, what other tools there may be to help deal with family issues. Family issues are big ones, and there's a lot of different ways that we work on them, and we tend to work on them in pieces to allow ourselves to come to peace with how we were raised. From Bridget, my heart also aches and has deep sorrow. Thanks, Suresh, like a core wound. Well, that's where you got to go, Bridget. You go into that core wound, to breathe into it, and to see what's really hurting. And you allow different emotions and thoughts to come up. The more you can be with that pain, the more it will resolve itself, and it will tell you what it's really about. Now, that's another reason why focusing inward is so important, because we often think we know what it is, but we don't. And a lot of our actions, once again, is usually to mask or medicate. And I didn't talk about this too much today, but that's another reason why I talk about going within first before moving to any sort of conscious action in the world, is because we spend a lot of time self-medicating by keeping busy, by having lots of caffeine, by drugs and alcohol and sex and adventure seeking, and all these different ways are ways that will avoid a deep sorrow like this rather than going towards the sorrow. And as all of you probably know, that doesn't work. You can't avoid yourself. You only get caught up in addictions, and that causes you even more pain than the initial pain itself. Susie really enjoyed it. You're welcome. You're welcome, Bridget, for the webinar. You're welcome, Laura. So I think we have time for one last question here. And just to wrap up, we're not looking to be perfect people, whatever that means. You just have to let go of any idea around perfection. Just appreciate that when you start to feel the sense of like things that you need to take action on, trust it. Just trust it, because in taking action, you'll start to see other opportunities. You'll see where you still have blind spots, different issues get illuminated, and then you can engage with them. And you just keep practicing being mindful and being humble with whatever is coming up in the moment. And then you take the next action from there. And it's really not a big deal. And I think the last point I want to make before I answer these last couple of comments here is that it isn't a big deal. We don't have to save the world. We don't have to jump over the moon. And there's a sense, I think, when we start talking about action and interacting with the world, that it's about some huge monumental effort. And it rarely is. It's usually about a bunch of little small, conscious, kind actions that you take that build up over time, little grains of sand. And then you have this beautiful sandcastle that you've created in life. And that's always a great metaphor because the sandcastle is transitory, that whatever we are creating in life is not going to last. And so we have to be doing the things that we love most, because then we'll enjoy it as much as we can. And we know it's going to pass away anyway. And so we can let it go in peace. So last comments from Esther. Cool, thanks. Yeah, I'm seeing I say I can't deal with this, but it just takes me away from the pain and repeats it again. Thanks for the wisdom. You're welcome. And you're welcome, Sean. Thanks for coming. And thanks to everyone for coming today. I hope this Awakening to Action was helpful. And as I said, please share and subscribe and whatever you feel called to do to help out. It really matters a lot. And as I said, a lot of things are just getting more difficult to stand out on the web these days. So hope to see you all again in about 4 weeks. And feel free to suggest any topics that you'd like to hear me talk about. Take care, everybody, and happy holidays for those of you who are celebrating them.